Good morning, CFC, and happy 4th of July. I know that the last time I spoke, I had talked about doing a series on the minor prophets, and I'm going to postpone that for one more time because it's July 4th, and it's the day we set off firecrackers and have a difficult time sleeping and trying to keep our babies and the baby within us from uh, staying awake during the firecrack season as people have the opportunity to, shall we say, do what we want, even late into the night. Uh, Pardon my satire. But I have found that, particularly during COVID, as we're not able to gather en masse to watch the fireworks communally, more and more individuals in neighborhoods are lighting up firecrackers long past their bedtime. But the thesis, the focus this morning on this July 4th is to hopefully help us understand that we have a misconstrued sense as to what freedom really is, particularly as it relates to freedom without constraints. Um, Let me give a couple of pop culture references from the late 60s, mid to late 60s, where a lot of cultural analysts say that some of our difficulties with the idolatry of freedom began, or at least were allowed to come to fruition. I'm thinking of some of you might remember the band from England, the Animals, spearheaded by a very, very fine songwriter and performer, Eric Burton. But one of their songs was "It's My Life." It's My Life. It was an anthem of the mid '60s. This was a couple of years before Haight-Ashbury and the Summer of Love in San Francisco. But Eric Burton of the Animals sang in a chorus, "It's my life and I'll do what I want. It's my life and I'll think what I want." And then he goes on to taunt masterfully, "Show me I'm wrong." Well, Jimi Hendrix, one of my favorite pop artists of the late 60s, would sing a song called "If Six Was Nine." If Six Was Nine. Near the end of his song, near the climax of it, he sings, kind of mutters in his Hendrix way, "I'm the one that's going to die when it's my time to die." And then he says, "So let me live my life the way I want to." And in many ways, he did. And I'm not saying that this is always the consequence, but for Jimi Hendrix, just a couple of years after he would record that song in September of 1970, he would die. I remember that happened just after I started at Spring Arbor College in 1970. And he was such a, shall we say, pop idol for me, that it was quite an existential crisis for me early on in my freshman year. But again, happy 4th of July, and let's focus on how we have a tendency in this country, because of our very real freedoms, um, freedom against government oppression, freedom against the presuppositions of a king with or queen with an overreach. Um, I'll remind us also, as we set up for a quick Bible study on the nature, on the characteristics of freedom from a biblical perspective. I'll also share the assessment of Viktor Frankl, who is an Austrian neurologist, a psychiatrist, a philosopher, author, and he was a Holocaust survivor. Right? He was the one that said, "Listen, I recommend that the Statue of Liberty be supplemented by a statue of responsibility. The Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a statue of responsibility on the West Coast." His implication, obviously, is that there's a balance between freedom and order, as Dr. Colson used to say, one of the Spring Arbor professors back in the 70s and 80s. There's a responsibility, there's a balance between freedom and responsibility. And the scriptures provide us with some important insights on that. But before I go there, I also wanted to share two of the four characteristics that the brilliant philosopher theologian Thomas Oden, who was, by the way, one of the mentors of a couple of our Spring Arbor teachers. One of them was Robert Moore Schoenfield, who studied under Thomas Oden. But Thomas Oden talks about four motifs of terminal modernity. I'm going to briefly mention two of the four because they help us understand, if we're not careful, that we make an idol out of our freedom. I can do what I want, right? He describes the modern time as narcissistic hedonism. Okay, narcissism being excessive and exclusive self-love. And it's a personality disorder that we're just learning more about and how to treat it. Not easy, but hedonism, narcissistic hedonism. And it was Thomas Oden that said that this characteristic of terminal modernity, he said, first characteristic is that it makes an idol out of our sexuality. Immediate justification for any immediate gratification of passion and desire. All proposals are subject to one dominant, he describes it as ascendant maxim. What makes me feel good now? I have great self-justification for fulfilling what makes me feel good now. And oftentimes it's, as Oden would emphasize, at the expense of other people, at the expense of the strength of community and the church. What makes me feel good now? And again, this is the first characteristic, according to Thomas Oden, the theologian, of our culture, right? Narcissistic hedonism. Secondly, he says it's autonomous individualism. It's the first characteristic is a narcissistic hedonism. What makes me feel good now? I'm entitled. The second is an autonomous individualism. And he describes it as working within the ideal of the detached self. Working within the ideal of the detached self. That's the spirit of our age. Detached from what? Responsibilities to friends, to family, to church, to community, to country. Because the ideal self in this postmodern age is one who is detached from all responsibilities. That's really living. Those are just two of the four, but they are directly tied, in my view, to my emphasis this morning is helping us think about the importance of transcending the propensity of the culture to worship freedom, to emphasize freedom without moral responsibility. I wanted to just bring up a few of the text of Scripture. First off, from Exodus chapter 20, starting with verse 2, when the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are listed, right? All of the Ten Commandments are prefaced by Yahweh saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, Israel. Who brought you out of Egypt. Why would he say that prior as a preface to the Ten Commandments? Essentially, he's saying parenthetically, in my view, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out of bondage miraculously, and I know how to keep you out of further bondage. And how's that? By keeping these 10 commandments. I think that that's an important preface to remember whenever we think of the law of God. Whenever we think of the 613 Mosaic commands, 365 of them are prohibitions, the others invitations to do something assertively that's holy and righteous. God is really concerned about our true freedom, which is rooted in sensitivity and obedience to his call, to his commands, to his invitations. We think of think of Psalm 119.